Okay, we are in Daniel chapter 2. Just a quick review of some of what we covered last week. Remember, we're in this part of the world, what we would call the Middle East. Recognize the north part of Africa. This is the Mediterranean Sea. This is Europe up here, France, Spain, England, Russia. And this at the far eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, this little tiny strip of land here, that's Israel. And over here, coming up through the Persian Gulf, there are two rivers that come down this direction and drain into the Persian Gulf. And those two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that area of the world is called Mesopotamia. It literally means the land between the rivers. So that's where we're zooming into a little bit. Here's a little bit bigger view. These are the two rivers, the Tigris to the north, the Euphrates to the south. They kind of come together just before they drain into the Persian Gulf, but they water this land and make it extremely fertile. Some of the richest, most fertile land, certainly in the area. And it forms kind of a crescent. It also joins with this area, this strip of land where Israel is, that's along the sea, and that area throughout history has been called the Fertile Crescent. And the trade routes, the highways of the day, would go up through that fertile area. That's where the cities were. The rest of this down here, this is the Arabian Desert. And it's crossable, but just barely. So Jerusalem and Israel is way over here near the Mediterranean Sea, and Babylon is over here. It's about 400 miles across there, or about 900 by the trade routes, if you travel through the highway system of the day. For reference, Baghdad is about 60 miles northwest of there, right about here, the capital of modern-day Iraq. Did I have? Yeah, you can see here's Baghdad, so Babylon would be just 60 miles southeast. Where's my button?
How many days did it take for the king to go capture all the Jewish? They had to walk.
That's a great question, and we don't really know. What's the speed of a caravan? They didn't travel any too fast, but there would have been huge caravan of supplies. Nebuchadnezzar's army was in the process of coming back from a battle down here in Egypt at the time. Mm-hmm. So probably weeks, possibly months to make that trip. All right, so again, just by quick review, we talked about this idea that God kind of divides world history, Gentile history, into a succession of 7 nations. Up until Daniel's time, 3 of them had already come and gone. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, and the Assyrians. Now we're coming into the time of what we call the New Babylonian Empire. Babylon had its day back around 1200 or so BC under a different king, but when he died, the empire kind of fell apart, was conquered by the Assyrians. But under this king by the name of Nabopolassar, Babylon once again regained greatness, and his son, Nebuchadnezzar, was a great general, and he reestablished Babylon. And he laid siege to Jerusalem on 3 different occasions, the first of which was started in 606 BC. But during that siege, Nebuchadnezzar's dad dies, the king. And so Nebuchadnezzar finds out that he is now the king. And he had conquered the city and was in the process of dealing with it when he got the news. And he left everything as it was, hightails it back to Babylon, straight across the desert there, but leaves his generals in charge. And they take captives. They take of the royalty and of the nobility of Israel, of which Daniel is among that group. So they're taking really the best and the brightest of Israel's citizens, young men, back to Babylon with them. Daniel is in this group along with his 3 friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. The 4 of them, among many, many others, are taken back to Babylon and put into a 3-year graduate school to learn all of the arts and sciences and politics and languages and everything you can imagine of the Babylonians or the Chaldean people in order to serve as kind of the cabinet members directly to the king. So Daniel is brought back. He's put into this training program, and along with his 3 friends.
I think we call that college.
Yeah, graduate school for sure. Yeah, this is intensive stuff. And so, but Daniel, in the first chapter, we saw where that all took place. And but Daniel continues to honor God. He's a Jew. He's one of God's chosen people, and he continues to obey the Jewish law. That in itself is fairly amazing. I mean, you figure you've been taken prisoner by people whose language you don't even speak and hauled off 900 miles to a faraway land. I suspect a lot of people would say, all bets are off. Whatever the rituals and the religions were at home, not sure I'm going to... Daniel's not like that. Daniel absolutely honors God with everything that he does. And
question.
Yeah.
Because I've studied Daniel several times, and this puzzles me. Was it a strategic thing to take the nobility of your enemy and bring him in and put him in a place of almost authority? What was... why would you do that?
Yeah, so great question. There's probably a couple of different aspects to this. One of the things that we see as we study these next 4 empires, we're going to see that they progressively get worse and worse. But the beginning ones, including Babylon, when they conquer their enemy, they are not all about the military, not really about conquering. In fact, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, even with his anger management problem, actually puts up with the Jewish people through 3 different sieges. It takes a 3rd time before 3 strikes and you're out, and he's had enough and he's done with them. But his preference is to establish relationship with them and work with them. And so he's putting his vassal kings in place there and that sort of thing. So my interpretation, what I think is the better interpretation among the different ones that are out there, is that Nebuchadnezzar is doing 2 things. Number one is he's teaching them a lesson. That there is a punitive aspect to this in that he's taking the best and the brightest from them. There's no doubt that's a blow. But at the same time, he's educating them, and I think that helps serve the purpose of building this bridge between the cultures. And we see this repeatedly with Babylon. We'll see it again with the Persians, and we see it hugely so with the Greeks. Alexander the Great. He conquered the armies, but his dream was to unite everybody, and he's the one that established school systems and roads and all this kind. When the Romans come through, they take pride in just leveling places. They're just, and we actually see that in the prophetic description of Rome as well, that they just obliterate their enemies. They have no desire to absorb or assimilate cultures. They want to inflict Roman culture on everybody and force them to conform. But Nebuchadnezzar's not like that. So I think there's this, yes, there's a punitive aspect to it, but I think more than anything else, this is an attempt to kind of bridge the cultures. And God works through that big time. So that's my thought. All right. Now we come to chapter 2. To start with, I actually have my Bible in front of me. Let's just read through this. And kind of get the overview, and then we'll go back and take it apart. This is always the hardest part of the study for me, is just to read through this without commenting. All right, now in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, "I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream." Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, saying, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll give the interpretation." But the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap." That's a polite way to put it. "However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation." So Nebuchadnezzar kind of explains his professional development plan to them a little more clearly. But they answered again and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we'll give its interpretation." And the king answered and said, "I know for certain that you would gain the time." In other words, you're stalling. "Because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation." In other words, if you can do that, then I'll trust your interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So this is the whole job classification. This even includes the students in training. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why so hasty? Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king, this is amazing, to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. And Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. For wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him." By the way, if you're reading along in your Bible and you notice that the formatting is a little different with this section, this is actually verse. This is a poem or a song that Daniel sings, apparently, of praise and worship to God.
You should have sang it while you were drinking.
Yeah, somehow we've neglected to get the music handed down. Where are we at here? 23. "I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand." Okay, end of Daniel's praise. Verse 24. "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, 'Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation.' Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, 'I found a man.'" Nothing like taking a little extra credit before the king, right? "I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation." The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologer, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while you were on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. In other words, God did this to save us as well as to answer your question. Nebuchadnezzar was wondering about these things. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory, and wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. Don't miss that. All. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. This is what we were talking about with regard to how the Romans conquered people. It's depicted here, and we'll see it again in chapter 7. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with the ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men. But they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face prostrate before Daniel and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, "Truly, your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Now that's saying something. And chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also, Daniel petitioned the king And he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Okay? Long chapter. And wow, what a chapter. All kinds of things going on here. All right, so backing up to the beginning again, we see that the timing of this is in Nebuchadnezzar's second reign. So we're in the neighborhood of 603 BC. Not exactly sure what time of year, so give or take a year, but we're right there. So this is also the second year after Daniel has been taken captive. So Daniel's still in the midst of his 3-year training program. He hasn't even graduated school yet, and all of a sudden he is the prime minister. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So Nebuchadnezzar is probably about 29 years old. Daniel is about 18 at this point. Again, give or take 6 months to a year. He's still in training. And we see that Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. Now, we're told throughout the course of the chapter that Nebuchadnezzar is wondering. He wants to know. He's curious about what's going to happen to the kingdom, his kingdom, to the world. What's going to play out after he's gone. What's his legacy is probably part of that, I'm guessing. But all of us wonder that at some level, but certainly a king, and certainly a king of the stature of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I didn't get it done again for this week, but eventually we're going to take a little side study during one of the chapters and look at the city of Babylon and see what Nebuchadnezzar actually built. It's truly, truly amazing. The city of Babylon was one of the original 7 wonders of the ancient world. Later on, few centuries afterward, some people adjusted things, and only the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were inducted into the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But initially, the city itself was. It's just and sources differ. There's a lot of disagreement as to exactly how big it was and how thick the walls were, double ring of walls, but an ancient historian that's generally pretty trustworthy by the name of Herodotus, who actually lived during that time and claims to have visited there, said that it was 15 miles on a side. We're talking the size of Indianapolis. Okay, this place is huge. Other modern scholars haven't been able to find the traces of anything quite that big. What we have been able to discover is considerably smaller, but still huge. It's more like 15 miles in circumference rather than 15 miles on a side. The city was laid out in a square, roughly, and had a double ring of walls with a moat in between them. These walls were so thick that they could conduct chariot races on top of the walls. Okay, again from Herodotus. We'll get into that later. But Nebuchadnezzar has built all of this, and so at this point he's wondering or is in the process of building. It's not all finished yet. What will come after this? So this list in verse 2, the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, the commentaries are filled with different investigations into what all of these things are. It sounds pretty iffy with the English words that this gets translated into, but in essence, these are the arts and sciences guys. These are the king's cabinet members. They are his advisors, his counselors. Now, they do the whole horoscope thing. What we would call astrologers is based somewhat on, all of that comes down. What we call astrology today actually comes down from Babylon. The Babylonians invented that stuff, or at least corrupted it from what was there earlier. We'll talk about that another time too. So there is a kind of a metaphysical aspect to what some of these guys do, but there's also the politics and the arts and sciences and all of that stuff as well. The sciences were tremendously advanced, really, in Babylon. Many of what we still use today originated in Babylon. The reason that we have 60 seconds in a minute, and 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle, all originates with the Babylonians. Okay?
Tim, how long did it take them to build a city that large?
Well, the city was originally built, 1,000 years ago. But it had largely been leveled by the Assyrians. But there was foundations there. Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, undertook a tremendous building campaign. And that was still ongoing at the time of his death, and Nebuchadnezzar took over and upped the ante even more. So Nebuchadnezzar is the one somehow who creates the Hanging Gardens, that nobody has any idea how they did that. Supposedly, according to modern archaeologists, the ancient Babylonians didn't have any knowledge of pumps. And yet Herodotus, this historian who lived then, describes a utility shed, a room in the walls that, with machinery in it that drew water out of the Euphrates and used it to water the gardens. Okay? Nobody has any idea how that worked. And it's very rightly considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And that was probably built later on, by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, some argue that it actually wasn't in Babylon at all, but that's not even going to get into that.
Was he putting the Jews to work to do that?
No, he does not take them slaves. He takes them captives, but he's really kind of integrating them into the culture. It's not like what the Egyptians did. Okay, good question.
Who was it, Chaldea?
Chaldea is the name of the region, and so Chaldeans and Babylonians is really synonymous for our purposes. Okay, the language is called Chaldean, but it's also called Aramaic, and it's based on ancient Akkadian. So all of these terms so correct. Stop me and ask if I'm using terms that I haven't explained well. All right, so Nebuchadnezzar basically calls all of his cabinet members, and this list of 4 different job classifications all falls under what we would, I think, collectively refer to as the Magi, or the wise men. Magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans, let the commentators and the scholars argue about exactly what the differences are between their job categories, but they're all advisors to the king, and Nebuchadnezzar brings them all forward. And what we think is going on at this point is, remember, Nebuchadnezzar is a fairly young guy. He's 29-ish at this point. His father had lived to a ripe old age. I don't remember off the top of my head how old he was when he died, but he's the one that had set up the kingdom and the cabinet members and all of this, kind of stuff. So here's this young guy is now finds himself king of the world, literally. Even God confirms that. No other king has been like Nebuchadnezzar in terms of what God has handed into him. He may not have controlled all of that, but God actually says to him, everything I've created, I have given over into your hands. It's an amazing idea. We could spend time on that, but we won't. But Nebuchadnezzar comes into kind of the old guard at this point, and he's probably got it in his mind that he wants to see what these guys are really made out of. What can they actually do? You guys are here because my father put you here, and you've been here, you're the career politicians at this point. But we're going to find out what you're really made out of. And that's kind of the feel of what Nebuchadnezzar does. We don't know whether Nebuchadnezzar actually remembered his dream or whether he'd truly forgotten it. All we know is he's not telling them. He says, you're going to do 2 things for me, or you're going to die. You're going to tell me what the dream was, and you're going to tell me the interpretation of it. And I'm not taking no for an answer. And they whine and moan and squirm and try to explain to him that nobody can possibly do this. He's not having any of it. And it almost has the feel that he's trying to get rid of them. But I don't know that. That's interpretation. So these are the guys that he calls before him. They have this argument. One point about the text. When we get to verse 4... we're told by Daniel as he's writing this, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. Now, I'm not sure that there was any other language. My understanding from what I read is that Aramaic was the normal language. That was the colloquial language of the day. It appears that Daniel may just be pointing out the obvious, but it actually has an effect on the text. Daniel changes from writing in Hebrew through chapter 1 and up through the first 3 verses of chapter 2 are written in Hebrew. Now, and let me finish. And at verse 4, it switches to Aramaic. And it'll continue. The book of Daniel continues being written in Aramaic through the end of chapter 7. Then in chapter 8, it switches back to Hebrew. Now, we talked a little bit about this last time. This has caused some scholars to believe that, well, it must have been written by different people, or it was written later in date, and all this. No. We're being told something important about the nature of the text. In the first chapter, we're being told about Israel, Daniel being taken captive out of his homeland, and Daniel being obedient to the laws of Moses, and what it's like for him and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to be kind of going through this indoctrination process, this assimilation process, the graduate school in Chaldea, and yet remaining true to God and his commands upon them. And so it's written in Hebrew. It makes sense. Here, Daniel now is being called upon to serve the king. Not even finished with graduate school, but because of God's grace to Daniel and through Daniel, really because of chapter 1, because of Daniel's faithfulness, God is using him as an instrument, and he's going to reward him hugely through Nebuchadnezzar. But now Daniel becomes really a part. He's a godly part, but he becomes a part of Babylonian society, of Chaldea.
Quick question about that. It's still this cultural thing. How many years now are we into the siege and the captivity? We're
2 years.
2 years. So Daniel's managed to learn Aramaic, and culturally, in Egypt, you had the Hebrews, and you had the Egyptians, and they were separate.
Right. In
Babylon, they're intermixed.
Mingled, right.
So there's probably intermarriage and other things going on there. Was that the intent? Was to basically blend those cultures together? And
Nebuchadnezzar's intent?
Yeah. And what really puzzles me, I know they're in captivity for a while, and when he reads the prophecy about, it was Darius.
Yeah. Cyrus is the one that conquers. Darius sets him free.
The prophecy was about it. All of a sudden, he sends them back.
Yeah. Darius, yeah.
How do you do that? You've got all those years to do it. So that is really perplexing. And the fact that he did write that in Aramaic, who was he writing that to?
Right. Now, it's interesting that we see that even Jesus spoke Aramaic. Skip ahead 600 years. Jesus is speaking Aramaic from the cross and so forth. So these languages, we're in a very polylinguistic, polycultural society here, and Babylon is certainly eclectic in that way because Babylon has expanded so great that they've assimilated these other cultures. So I think we have this idea that the cultures can still be, look at today. A good example is the Mexican culture, okay? Frequently, they don't even know English, okay? Or they're that's very clearly a second language. And you find differences amongst different people depending on what their jobs are and how much they want to integrate. But you can have these people that are, to some extent, kind of that iron mixed with clay thing, integrated with the culture and yet still able to maintain their own culture as well. And my thought is that that's what's happening with the Jews. Because God had been so specific, they now have the law of Moses, they've had that for some time, and God is very specific about not intermarrying. We don't know what actually happened. There's good practicing Jews and not so good, so some of that undoubtedly, but probably the Jews recognized that they needed to keep their culture alive and they needed to stay as isolated as possible. But I think from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, part of why he's doing this is the purpose of integrating and breaking down those walls.
Basically, making so the Hebrews don't even exist anymore.
Right.
Diluting them.
Right. They've been so rebellious because. I'm sorry?
She said the Borg.
The Borg. That's exactly right. I've been thinking the same thing.
Okay.
Right. that was a common tactic amongst the strategy of the rulers of the time, is to assimilate cultures in order to break down these animosities and friction, especially with a rebellious group like the Jews were, that had, after the third siege and so forth. So I think a lot of that's going on.
Why was the timing of the vision at that time, when he wasn't even graduated yet?
Great question. That's a good question for God. I don't necessarily have an answer. My suspicion is that, number one, for whatever reason, this is when Nebuchadnezzar is wondering about this. Okay, so it's a good time for Nebuchadnezzar. But I think for Daniel's sake, I think it illustrates that Daniel's wisdom is not because he's a graduate school guy. Okay, it's not because he's been trained in all of these great things and all the cultures and all this kind of stuff. It's because of God. So he's still a humble student at this point. And Daniel, one of the great things that we continue to see about Daniel is Daniel does not touch the glory of God at all. He makes no bones about, I've studied this, and so this is what I think the interpretation. No. He says, no man, even your most advanced scholars, cannot give you the interpretation. This is impossible with men. But there is a God in heaven who can. So Daniel is humbled, and God makes it clear to Nebuchadnezzar, makes it clear to Daniel, makes it clear to everybody that this is not because of who Daniel is, it's because of who God is. So I think that's probably part of it. All right. So the text switches to Aramaic. In verse 4, we see this little standard greeting, O king, live forever. We're going to see that, I think, 5 times in Daniel. It occurs a couple other times in other places in the Old Testament. It's just a standard way to honor the king when you begin a conversation. Doesn't mean any more than that. Slide 7. All right, the king answered the Chaldeans. They have this little discussion about Nebuchadnezzar's professional development plan, and he makes it very clear to them, you will be cut into pieces, and he's not kidding. This is not an exaggeration. That's absolutely what he did, and much worse. And your houses shall be made an ash heap. The Hebrew word there is a nevalu, and it means a stinking refuge heap. Probably more accurately, a dunghill, literally. This is what he would do with their houses, and their families would be killed with them. So he makes it quite clear that there's no negotiation in the process here. They try to stall. He calls them on it. Skipping forward, this is pretty straightforward here. Stop me if you have any questions. But you will tell me the dream and its interpretation. He says, if you can tell me the dream, then I'll believe your interpretation. Anybody can tell me an interpretation, and I won't know if it's right or not. You can go read the horoscope in the paper, and you have no idea, what kind of nonsense this is. Or if something's actually truly from God, or somebody has this kind of skill. I don't know. You can tell me that dream, I'll believe you on the interpretation. Sorry?
Why does he have to know?
Have to know what?
Ned, why does he have to know what the dream is?
He was determined to find what that was.
Well, I think it's clear to Nebuchadnezzar that this dream is something special. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill dream that he wondered if somebody might have an interpretation to. This was something really powerful that was given to him by God. And I think God is behind his desire to find that out as well. God's got this all of this is planned by God. God is orchestrating. Sorry?
It's not just Ned that is a part of wanting to know.
I'm sorry? I'm not understanding your question.
I didn't word that right, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Good.
So Ned and Jesus both want to know what the dream is?
Daniel, maybe?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to say Jesus.
You're close. Daniel wants to know what the dream is because it's going to save him from being cut into pieces and his house made a dunghill. He doesn't want to die. But ultimately Daniel wants to glorify God. So if Daniel is offering himself to God through this prayer, the all-night prayer vigil that he and his buddies have, but it's really about Nebuchadnezzar, I think, sensing that God's trying to tell him something, and he wants to know what it is, and he's using that as a means of calibrating his magi. Okay?
What's the difference between Daniel's having to interpret the dream and Joseph being told the dream? Why do you think that the similarities differ in how God used the two dreams? One was told to Joseph. Joseph's dream was told to him. And God gave him the interpretation. Here, like she's asking.
That is an awesome question. I have no answer for that. I never thought of that question. I will work on that.
Can you repeat that?
The question is, we're comparing contrasting Daniel and Joseph. Both of them, there's enormous numbers of similarities between Daniel and Joseph, ultimately because both of them are types of Jesus. When we do Genesis, I list over 220 different things about Joseph's life that parallel what's going on.
The one that was thrown into the pit.
Yes, yes, the 12 brothers. Joseph is the youngest. The coat of many colors and all that. Yeah. The last quarter almost of Genesis is about the life of Joseph, and his life parallels Daniel, and both of them parallel Jesus. And so Patrick is asking, both of them have a dream and an interpretation that becomes very, very important in their lives. Now, Joseph also interpreted the dreams of the two guys down in the prison as well, the baker and the wine steward. So anyway, he's asking, in the one case, in Daniel's case, somebody else has the dream and Daniel gives the interpretation. In Joseph's case, Joseph has the dream and his father gives the interpretation, or at least recognizes the interpretation. Why the difference? That's the question, and I don't have any idea, but it's a great question. All right, let's move on. So Daniel finds out that there's some fascinating insights into Daniel's character here on just lots of levels. We could spend a whole study just looking at the character of Daniel. But one of the ways that Daniel's character is indicated is by the effect that he has on other people around him. Here's the king's guard, this guy Arioch, the captain of the king's guard. He's the Secretary of Defense. Okay, he's a direct cabinet member. He's the one who is in control over the entire Babylonian army, the most powerful army in the world at this point. And Nebuchadnezzar gives him an order: go and kill everybody in the job classification of the Magi. Arioch is accustomed to obeying orders. He sees what happens to people who don't obey Nebuchadnezzar's orders. But when he comes to Daniel, he has a conversation with him. That's amazing. Okay? That reflects the relationship that Daniel already has as a student already has with these important men in Babylon. These guys have recognized and somehow gotten to know Daniel. Whether he's reached out to them or what, we don't know the details of that. But Arioch is willing to put the king's orders on hold to have a conversation. And not only that, Daniel asks a favor. He says, can you hold off a minute? I'd like to go have a conversation with the king. And that may be even the greatest part of this whole chapter, that Daniel has the authority, the privilege of walking into the king's audience chamber and asking a question of the king. That's just phenomenal. For a student and a captive from a foreign culture, Daniel walks in and asks the king, could you stop what you're doing and give me a chance to see if I can answer your question? And Nebuchadnezzar agrees.
I think that dream was eating him up so bad he was desperate.
Any possibility, he's willing. But it absolutely speaks, Daniel should have been killed on sight. Sorry?
None of the other guys even wanted to try. They were all stalling. Here's a guy coming to him saying, hey, let me have a shot.
They didn't, none of them had a prayer meeting. So we just learn all kinds of things about the character of Daniel and his relationships with his enemies. Now there's a whole study to be done there too. The Babylonians just conquered Israel. They just tore down the walls. There was a siege that people were eating each other because of this multi-year siege before Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered them and took them all captive. And yet Daniel has established these relationships with the heads of state in Babylon. All right, slide 8. So Daniel goes to his house. That's interesting. And tells his buddies what's going on. Made the decision of the king known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And says, hey guys, we've got a prayer meeting tonight. Drop what you're doing. This is kind of important. And they do. They pray. But I find the next verse really interesting. Verse 19. We're told that the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Now, the interpretation of that is that this is in a dream. It's a vision, but it's a dream. That means Daniel's gone to bed. Could you go to sleep without having gotten the answer yet from God? I don't think I could have. That's faith. So there's just so much richness that you can pull out of this if you kind of put yourself in the shoes of these people and experience what's going on. Daniel has gone to bed and in faith, believing that God is going to take care of this. Now, that's my interpretation, but I think that's pretty straightforward. And sure enough, God comes through and reveals the whole thing to Daniel in another dream. So here's Daniel having a dream, like Joseph, right? All right, so Daniel then praises God with this magnificent poem or song or whatever it is, of worship and honor to God. Daniel absolutely remains humble in every sense before the king, before his captors in Babylon, and certainly before God himself. He honors God for who he is. He praises him for the things that he's done in the past, and he is thanking him for doing what we asked of you. There in the last part of verse 23. You have now made known to me what we asked of you. Thank you. Okay. All right, so Daniel then goes back to Arioch, says, take me to the king. And Arioch takes credit for this. You got to love Arioch. Arioch says, I have found a man from amongst the captives who can give you the interpretation. Now, you got to wonder what Nebuchadnezzar thinks of this, because Daniel already came to Nebuchadnezzar and asked for permission to go off and pray about this, right? So, how this has not been made into a movie, I have no idea. All right, so going down, where are we here? Verse Nebuchadnezzar asks him. It's interesting. Daniel actually says that he's going to make known the interpretation, but the king responds. I'm putting words in his mouth, obviously, but that's not what I ask. He says in verse 26, are you able to make known the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Let's make no mistake about what the requirement is here. And Daniel takes the opportunity to say, no, I can't. He wants to be very clear that this is all about God, not Daniel. There is no man who can do this. The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Now that phrase appears in Scripture in just a few places, but it refers to the end times. It's the same idea. And there's some argument about exactly when this period begins and ends. But he's talking about the things that will come after this, and ultimately what leads to the kingdom of God on earth, the second coming of Christ. Daniel realizes that this is the end of time he's talking about. This is the end of the world. The interpretation of this vision of Nebuchadnezzar leads all the way through to the end of the world. And then Daniel proceeds to reveal the dream. And without going through word for word, Daniel describes what Nebuchadnezzar saw, which is an image. He doesn't say that it's in the shape of a man, but he lists all body parts of human beings. So clearly this image is in the shape of a man. And in your handout, you'll see kind of some artist's interpretation of that. But also that handout relates, we're going to go through these same 4 empires when we get to the latter chapters in much more detail. Daniel himself gets a series of visions that reveals a tremendous amount of detail about these coming kingdoms. But here we see it through Nebuchadnezzar, through human beings, through the secular world's point of view. And the way Nebuchadnezzar's dream depicts these 4 empires is as precious metals in decreasing value, but they're precious metals. It's very worldly in that sense. But it's of great value to the Gentiles, to the human beings. When God depicts this to Daniel, it's a series of 4 ravenous beasts. That's kind of God's view of these human empires. Okay, but we'll get to that stuff later. So he divides the image into 4 parts. When you read through this, at first glance, it seems like there's 5, but the last 2 are really part of the same. So the head is of gold, and the chest and the arms are of silver. Again, it's decreasing value of these precious metals. The belly and the thighs are of bronze, and then the legs are iron. And lastly, the feet, which really are part of that 4th empire. And that's important. And as we go through the interpretation, we'll see that, and we'll see it even more clearly when we get to the other visions of the same thing later, in later chapters. But the legs are of iron, but there's kind of 2 phases to this last empire. And that's going to become really important. And I'm just going to leave that for right now. So Daniel then interprets the dream, interprets what this polymetallic image is and the 4 different metals, and he says each one is a successive empire, and you, O king, are this first empire. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. He has been granted by God his rulership over the entire earth. The Bible tells us that all authority is given by God. The next empire, he doesn't list these. We only know the labels to these because we can look back in history and see who these things were. And it's extremely clear that these visions, the prophetic interpretation that Daniel gives here came to pass in tremendous detail. And when we get to chapters 7 and 8 and so forth, we're going to see even more detail that just describes. So much so that when Cyrus captures Babylon, one of the priests shows him the career, shows him that what he just did was prophesied by Daniel. And it impresses Cyrus. Cyrus recognizes what he did. Same thing happens again 250 years later with Alexander the Great. Alexander is conquering the world at that time. The Greek Empire is the biggest yet. All by the time Alexander is 32. All the way to India he conquers. And when he gets to Jerusalem, he's ticked off about some things that we'll deal with this more later on. But one of the priests comes out to him and shows him his career, everything that he's been doing for the past few years as he's conquering the world, shows him in detail in the book of Daniel his own career. And Alexander is so impressed that he spares the city. Okay? Matter of history. Secular historians record this. All right, we got to wrap this up. So we've got these successive world empires. The Babylonians, who are conquered by the Persians, who are conquered by the Greeks, who was conquered by the Romans, and then the Romans, who conquered the Romans? Nobody conquered the Romans. The Romans are actually still around. The Roman Empire covered most of Europe, much of North Africa, really, in fact, the joke is, not a joke, they actually considered it that the Mediterranean Sea became a Roman lake. Rome was the biggest empire in the world for a long, long time. The European Union may exceed it today, but it completely encompassed the Mediterranean Sea and extended great distances off in different directions. But all of those areas and all of those people that had become part of the Roman Empire, when Rome fell, it kind of disintegrated from within. It was more due to moral chaos than anything else, and there's a long study, lots and lots of people who studied why. Why did Rome fall? What happened? Well, John Gribben's famous, gigantic, multi-volume set of, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But nobody ever actually conquers Rome. Rome splits into pieces and becomes what today are the various countries of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East and so forth. And again, we'll study that later. But that's this idea that the legs of iron are the Roman Empire, the strength of iron, but the feet are broken apart by the stone that's cut without hands. Well, Christianity is actually a big part of what became the demise of the Roman Empire.
Do you
For
think
very,
maybe
go ahead.
the Catholic Church, the Vatican, has somewhat morphed into a religious kingdom? Because the Vatican is the wealthiest entity on the face
Right.
of the earth, and probably the most powerful and most influential. So there's still some ties.
Absolutely. In fact, the Vatican and its territory referred to itself as the Holy Roman Empire. The church, for a long period of time, and by the way, that lasted up into the 1800s. A lot of people don't know that. Large portions of Europe were owned by the Catholic Church and considered the Holy Roman Empire, and the Papal States and so forth. And so, in some sense, the Roman Empire continues through the church, through the organized church of the day. And we'll cover a little bit more of that later on. But ultimately, in terms of the political kingdom that was the Roman Empire, its collapse from within is partly due to its own moral and political decay and chaos, and the rulers were just a nightmare for long periods of time, but also because of the rise of Christianity, and it, in essence, destroyed and kind of carried away much of what was originally great about Rome. A lot of that was lost during the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, but I'm get off track into that. But that's what we're seeing in the vision when Daniel describes that the stone cut without hand. That stone is Jesus Christ. Okay, make no mistake. Jesus refers to himself as the rock, and there are numerous places, and it's in your notes in the handout and such. There are numerous places in Scripture that refer to Jesus Christ as a rock or a stone or a cornerstone or all of these different idioms. And that's what Daniel is seeing here. That's what breaks the Roman Empire into pieces. Okay? But then later, sometime later, those pieces come back together. And that's actually what we've been seeing for the past several decades, is the recoalescing into what Daniel would describe as the feet. Scholars call it Rome Phase 1 and Rome Phase 2. So the ancient Roman Empire is Rome Phase 1. They've been scattered, and we've had this period of time that we refer to as the Church Age. Not quite 2,000 years. Rome falls apart in about 450 AD-ish. And it's kind of a gradual thing. You can't just put a single year on it, but that's 450-something, 452, 454 is when Rome is sacked by the Huns. It's chaos at that point. That's really kind of the end of it. If you want to draw a particular moment in history when Rome is done. For the most part, the capital even of Christianity is moved to Constantinople. Now later on there's a resurgence, and they argue about who's the rightful heirs, and that's what results in the Great Schism around 1000 AD between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Church. Anyways, we'll get into that later. But for 1,500 years, almost 2,000 years now, 1,500 years, those pieces have just been scattered, mostly through Europe. And the borders are changing here and there, and there's wars and different cultures and these sorts of things. But the peoples and the backgrounds and the histories are still there. Nobody ever conquered them. Nobody ever did away with them. They've just morphed a little bit. But now what we've begun to see with the reestablishment of, or the establishment of the European Union are the recombining of those pieces. Now I'm a little ahead of myself, but we're out of time, so I'm going to skip forward. So here's kind of the series of these empires and when they fall. We'll study those in more detail later. Here in the revived Roman Empire, since about 1951, it was really after World War II. When World War II happened, the Europeans, we here in the United States, we sent people, we were involved. Obviously, it affected the whole culture, but it was over there. We didn't have tanks rolling through our backyards. Okay? We weren't destroyed. We didn't suffer the runaway inflation where thousands of dollars were required to buy a loaf of bread like the people in Europe did. And when World War II ended, the heads of many of those countries got together and said, this must never happen again. And that was the beginnings of what we're seeing today as the European community or the European Union. And I won't go through all these in detail, but you can see this progression. In fact, this treaty that was signed in 1957 was actually called the Treaty of Rome. It's because it was signed in Rome, but it's just fascinating that we're seeing the pieces of the Roman Empire begin to try to get along again. That hasn't happened for 1,500 years. And it's been really, really slow. It's been extremely difficult to bridge the financial and the political and the cultural divisions, even the language barriers. But these guys have been at it decade after decade after decade. And we see groups of nations begin to form around trade agreements and finances. And this is continuing into what we refer to as the European community. Various trade associations are formed between different countries, and then those associations come together, and we're seeing the pieces come back together. It's been fascinating to watch. In '93, huge accomplishment. Kind of scary, but it's also an interesting political. The Maastricht Treaty was signed, and that really was the birth of the European Union, and the euro dollar, what we call the euro for short, came out of that. It's been interesting that the groups of nations that joined came in sixes. There were 3 groups of 6s for a long time. I think there's been more added to that. Don't take that as it's just for fun. Okay, this has got nothing to do with the 666 Revelation. But it's fun, right? Europe actually has a national anthem. I think I skipped something I wanted to point out here. Don't know that I've actually got it in my notes here. Maybe not. I have to look in my own notes. What many people don't realize about the European communities is not just a trade and kind of mutual protection type of a community. It is much, much deeper than that. The European community actually has its own parliament. Do you know that? Many of the countries involved have their own parliaments, but the EU actually has its own parliament. They have their own national anthem.
Do they have their own military?
I think they do, and that's what I was trying to find in my notes here. Could have sworn I had the single foreign policy, single military, yes, single. So that's the UN, the UN troops. Okay, single currency is the euro dollar, and even their own national anthem. So it's some of this was done fairly quietly, and some of it was done rather underhandedly. A lot of people have complained about how some of these treaties were pushed through in the middle of the night when various places weren't meeting. The entire parliament weren't there in some of these countries when the country's leadership signed up to this, but it's happening. And yes, it has some fantastic benefits, especially to the countries involved, It's proving to be a major pain to the United States, mostly because of our own screwed up policies. It doesn't need to be, but it's becoming a world power. It is a world power. It's a huge world power as it is. And so what we're seeing is a joining of arms, a forging of a new union amongst these pieces of the ancient Roman Empire. It's been very difficult for them, but they are coming together. And so we get this sense as we read. The pieces will adhere to one another, but they won't have the same strength that the original Roman Empire had. That was Daniel's interpretation of the miry clay, iron mixed with clay. Miry clay is clay that doesn't even stick to itself very well. It's mixed with sand or dirt, is what that means. We're told in Scripture that this coalition will once again rise to world domination. And I'm going to quit there. We'll deal more with this when we get to the details of it later on. Yeah.
So I know, like, I don't know, you say world domination. So when I think of like some of like, well, Nebuchadnezzar and like Babylon and all that, obviously, they were just like a world power, obviously. But he didn't like necessarily have rule over these other places that aren't in the known like world.
Right.
So when it talks about world domination or whatever in the future, does that mean just like a world superpower? Or does
Great
it mean
question. Right.
everything?
I think that in the prophecies that relate to that, it's pretty clear that we really are talking about the whole world in that time. What's important, I think, to understand about Nebuchadnezzar is you're absolutely right. The Babylonian Empire, and eventually I'll draw some maps about how big each one of these successive empires is bigger than the last, but none of them conquered the whole world. What we know is the world. They would have considered it the world. Okay, that was as far as their, to some extent. But we know now that ancient China was in existence at the time, and none of this includes them. They were isolated. But that's part of the issue, is that they were isolated. There are probably other cultures, although they don't have great empires. And I'm not 100% sure exactly how advanced the Chinese were. I think they were fairly well along. But they're maybe the only ones that had any kind of an actual culture or an empire or a dynasty, so to speak, at the time that this stuff is going on. So what God says to King Nebuchadnezzar through Daniel is that I have given you the whole world. And I think God's meaning is truly the whole world. Nebuchadnezzar hasn't taken ownership of it. And he wouldn't have lived long enough to do that. Alexander came a little closer. Had he lived, heaven knows, how big the Greek Empire would have gotten. Nobody quite knows what it was that killed him, but he died at the age of 32 mysteriously in Babylon, by the way. He made Babylon his capital. So did the Persians. Everybody who writes about Babylon, the ancient historians and so forth, write with this sense of awe about the city of Babylon. Alexander chooses to make it his empire headquarters instead of Athens. That's amazing all by itself. But Nebuchadnezzar may not have taken ownership of it, but God is actually telling him, I've given you authority over every creeping thing that moves, over the entire creation. That's an amazing idea. And unfortunately, it goes straight to Nebuchadnezzar's head, as we're going to see in the next chapter. But the fact that they didn't take ownership makes it a little difficult to kind of talk in those terms, because in some places it says world, and it really means the known world, the extent of the culture at that time, the extent of the trade, the trade world, maybe we could call it. And other times when the Bible talks about the world, it's really the earth and everybody and everything that lives on it. So, good question, and it's some level of interpretation sometimes has to be brought to bear to sort those things out. Okay, other questions?
I have one that's kind
Sure.
And talk about, especially in the end times, you talk about the European Union and all that stuff. My question is, and from a spiritual perspective, we know that Islam is taking over Europe, basically. We have the Vatican there, and you've got Islam spread out all over the place. Do you believe, I'm getting way ahead here, but do you believe that the Vatican will soon be armed again, and you will have your Roman army to fight Islam for dominance over the world? Because I can't see somebody, an Islamic leader, being the Antichrist. He doesn't fit the mold. He doesn't fit the ingredients. I don't even necessarily think a pope fits the Antichrist role. But I know that the Vatican, the Catholic Church, is so huge, so powerful. If they were armed and you had the Crusades all over again, they would decimate.
Yeah. Certainly, they could mobilize an army bigger than anything else.
Do you see that as being a possibility?
I don't, and it's just an opinion. Heaven knows. Certainly, the end times are filled with lots of military conflicts, from the Battle of Armageddon to several others that are mentioned. Most of those battles are seen through the lens of Israel, and it has to do with the whole world coming against them, rather than the forging of this. The seventh kingdom and the 10-nation alliance and all of that stuff, out of which comes the Antichrist. But when Babylon falls, the description is of trade. Okay? The world mourns the loss of the trade that's associated with Babylon. And so my suspicion is that rather than it being a military conquest, what we're seeing with the European Union, and I don't know that I don't actually think it is that final nation, or the 10-nation alliance. We were way past 10 nations a long time ago. The 10 nations actually come out of that seventh kingdom. They don't come together to form it. A lot of people misunderstand that out of the book of Revelation. But I think that it's building a foundation for whatever that is going to be, and I think that the Islam has some part in that, and I think the Catholic Church has some part of that, and I think the European community has some part in that. How they fit together and how they relate, I think we're all going to be surprised when we see how it actually falls into place. Oh, that's what that meant, and everybody's going to say, oh, I guess all of the books on the shelf, that the library filled with all the different opinions of the scholars about how this was going to work, they're all going to be wrong. But I think what we're seeing with the European community is probably a decent model of how things are going to move forward. Rather than being done militarily, the bulk of the world after World War II is terrified of military conflict. And to the extent that even when the Gulf Wars and things like that are happening, people aren't even willing to get involved when they should be. Instead, what we're seeing is a much more reasoned, much more thoughtful, much more strategic, political, and really through trade and oil and utilities and things like that. That's how these things are, how the gaps are being bridged and the walls are being brought down. So that's my suspicion, is that this is going to be a lot more about trade agreements and treaties and a gentler, kinder world domination policy that I think is part of what lures people into that. Okay? If it were military, it would offend a lot more. And you can't have the entire world come together and be willing to follow one guy if it's done militarily. I mean, that's a guess, that's my opinion, but that's what I think. I think he's going to be so shrewd, so wise, so crafty in how he breaks down barriers rather than confronts and dominates, that everybody's willing to sign up. Once the church is out of here and the truth is gone, everybody's willing to fall for that. And that's kind of the picture that I think Scripture paints of that. So, great question. All right, let's close. Father, once again, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for the amazing depth of your word. We thank you for being here, and I would ask that nobody remembers anything that I said except what has come from you, except what is true about your word, and that you would take those seeds and plant them deeply in our hearts and use them to draw us closer to you. Teach us about the richness of your word and about its use in our lives and its trustworthiness more than anything else, and how we find you and draw closer to you through it. We thank you and love you in Jesus' name. Amen.